Point 2, Labor Market or Supply of Labor. This chapter covers Introduction to Supply of Labor, Work versus Leisure, Wages and Labor Supply, in which we study reservation wage rate, backward bending labor supply curve, market supply curve, competitive labor market equilibrium, influences on the supply of labor. It is adult population, preferences, time in school and training. Labor market with a union. Labor market equilibrium with union, influence on labor demand, influence on labor supply, the union and the non-union wage gap. The first one, the supply of labor. People supply labor to earn an income. Many factors influence the quantity of labor that a person plans to provide, but a key factor is the wage rate. In the labor market, the roles of firms and households are the reverse of what they are in markets for goods and services. A good such as wheat is supplied by firms and demanded by households. Labor, though, is demanded by firms and supplied by households. How do people decide how much labor to supply? Work versus leisure. Because workers are human beings too and have other uses for their time. So the decision about how much labor to supply involves making a decision about time allocation, how many hours to spend on different activities. Now the question arises as to how does a rational individual decide how much leisure to consume? By making a marginal comparison, of course. Consider Clive, an individual who likes both leisure and the goods money can bring or buy. Suppose that his wage rate is $10 per hour. In deciding how many hours he wants to work, he must compare the marginal utility of an additional hour of leisure with the additional utility he gets from $10 worth of goods. If $10 worth of goods adds more to his total utility than an additional hours of leisure, he can increase his total utility by giving up an hour of leisure in order to work an additional hour. If an extra hour of leisure adds more to his total utility than $10 worth of goods, he can increase his total utility by working one fewer hour in order to gain an hour of leisure. Wages and labor supply. An individual decision about time allocation is affected when his wage rate changes. The quantity of labor individual supplies can either rise or fall when his wage rate rises. Think about the labor supply decision of Jill, one of the workers at Angelo's bakery. Let's see how the wage rate influences the quantity of labor she is willing to supply. Reservation wage rate. For most people, leisure is more fun than works, so to induce them to work, they must be offered a wage. Jill would be willing to work at Angelo's bakery only if she earns at least wage rate of $5 an hour. This is called reservation wage rate because this is the lowest or minimum wage rate at which a worker would be willing to accept a particular type of job. At any wage rate above her reservation wage, Jill supplies more labor. Backward bending labor supply curve. If Jill were offered a wage rate between $5 and $10 an hour, she would want to work fewer hours. If she were offered a wage rate above $10 an hour, she would want to work more hours, but only up to a point. If Jill could earn $25 an hour, she would be willing to work 40 hours a day and earn $1,000 a week. But at a wage rate about $25 an hour, with the goods and services Jill can buy for $1,000, her priority would be a bit more leisure time. So if the wage rate increased above $25 an hour, Jill would cut back on her work hours and take more leisure. Jill's labor supply curve eventually bends backward as shown in the figure. Jill's labor supply curve is S. Jill supplies no labor at wage rates below her reservation wage of $5 an hour. As the wage rate rises about $5 an hour, the quantity of labor that Jill supplies increases to a maximum of 40 hours a week at a wage rate of $25 an hour. As the wage rate rises above $25 an hour, Jill supplies a decreasing quantity of labor. Her labor supply curve bends backward. The income effect on the demand for leisure dominates the substitution effect. Substitution effect. At wage rate below $25 an hour, the higher the wage rate Jill is offered, the greater is the quantity of labor that she supplies. Jill's wage rate is her opportunity cost of leisure. If she quits work an hour early to catch a movie, the cost of her extra hour of leisure is the wage rate that Jill forgoes. The higher the wage rate, the less willing Jill is to forego the income and take an extra leisure time. This tendency for a higher wage rate to induce Jill to work longer hours is the substitution effect. Income effect. The higher Jill's wage rate, the higher is her income. A higher income, other things remaining the same, induces Jill to increase the demand for most goods and services. Leisure is one of those goods. Because an increase in income creates an increase in the demand for leisure, it also creates a decrease in the quantity of labor supplied. Market supply curve. Jill's supply curve shows the quantity of labor supplied by Jill as her wage rate changes. Most people behave like Jill and have a backward bending labor supply curve, but they have different reservation wage rates and wage rates at which their labor supply curve bend backward. The market supply curve shows the quantity of labor supplied by all households in a particular job market. It is found by adding together the quantities of labor supplied by all households to a given job market at each wage rate. Also, along a supply curve in a particular job market, the wage rates available in other job markets remain the same. For example, along the supply curve of car wash workers, the wage rates of a car salespeople, mechanics, and all other labor are constant. Despite the fact that an individual's labor supply curve eventually bends backward, the market supply curve of labor slopes upward. The higher the wage rate for car wash workers, the greater is the quantity of labor supplied in that labor market. Competitive labor market equilibrium. Labor market equilibrium determines the wage rate and employment. The market is in equilibrium. The quantity of labor demanded equals the quantity supplied at a wage rate of $10 an hour when 300 workers are employed. If the wage rate exceeds $10 an hour, this quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded and the wage rate will fall. If the wage rate is below $10 an hour, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied and the wage rate will rise. Influences on the supply of labor. The supply of labor changes when influences other than the wage rate changes. The key factors that change the supply of labor are adult population, preferences, time in school and training. Adult population. An increase in the adult population causes either by birth rate that exceeds the death rate or by immigration increases the supply of labor. Historically, the population of the United States has been strongly influenced by immigration. Preferences. In 2011, 53% of women had jobs, up from 35% in 1959. In contrast, in 2011, 64% of women had jobs, down from 80% in 1959. Many factors contributed to these changes, which economics classifies as changes in preferences. These changes occur slowly but accumulates to make a large difference in the supply of labor. The result has been a large increase in the supply of female labor and a decrease in the supply of male labor. Time in school and training. When the amount of work that people want to do at a given wage rate changes, supply of labor changes. An increase in the adult population or any increase in the percentage of women with jobs increases the supply of labor. An increase in college enrollment decreases the supply of low-skilled labor. Later, it increases the supply of high-skilled labor. Changes in the supply of labor shifts the supply of labor curve, just like the shifts of the supply curve. A labor market with a union. A labor union is an organized group of workers that aim to increase the wage rate and influence other job conditions. Labor market equilibrium with a union. Figure illustrates what happens to the wage rate and employment when a union successfully enters a competitive labor market. With no union, the demand curve is DC, the supply curve is SC, the wage rate is $10 an hour, and 300 workers have job. Now a union enters this labor market. First, look at what happens if the union has sufficient control over the supply of labor to be able to restrict supply below its competitive level to SU. If there is all the union is able to do, employment falls to 200 workers and the wage rate rises to $15 an hour. Suppose now the union is also able to increase the demand for the labor to DU. The union can get an even bigger increase in the wage rate and with a smaller fall in employment. By maintaining the restricted labor supply to SU, the union increases the wage rate to $20 an hour and achieves an employment level of 250 workers. Because the union restricts the supply of labor in the market in which it operates, the union's actions spill over into the non-union worker markets. Workers who can't get union jobs must look elsewhere for work. This action increases the supply of labor in non-union markets and lowers the wage rate in those markets. This spillover effect further widens the gap between union and non-union wages. Influences on labor demand. A union tries to increase the demand for the labor of its members in four main ways. And increasing the value of marginal product of its members by organizing and sponsoring training schemes and apprenticeship programs and by professional certification. Lobbying for import restriction and encouraging people to buy goods made by unionized workers. Supporting minimum wage laws which increase the cost of employing low-skilled labor and lead firms to substitute high-skilled union labor for low-skilled non-union labor. Lobbying for restrictive immigration laws to decrease the supply of foreign workers. Influence on labor supply. One way of raising the wage rate is to decrease the supply of labor. In some labor markets, a union can restrict supply by controlling entry into apprenticeship program or by influencing job qualification standards. Markets for skilled workers, doctors, dentists, and lawyers are the easiest ones to control in this way. If there is an abundant supply of non-union labor, a union can't decrease supply. For example, in the market for farm labor in Southern California, the flow of non-union labor from Mexico makes it difficult for the union to control the supply. On the demand side of the labor market, the union faces a trade-off. The demand for labor curve slopes downward, so restricting supply to raise the wage rate costs job. For this reason, unions also try to influence the demand for union labor. The union and the non-union wage gap. The evidence suggests that after allowing for skill differences, the union and non-union wage gap lies between 10% to 25%. For example, unionized airline pilots earn about 25% more than non-union pilots with the same level of skill.